Hello everybody and welcome to yet another of Alan Robson's Grisly Tales podcasts. Thank you so much for all of your help on robsonsworld.com as well. And for those of you making donations, I could not be more grateful at this time. Thank you so very, very much. However, let's get down to what the podcast is all about tonight. We're going to do a bit on torture, which has always been one of my specialities. I've been married 5 times. And the other thing that we're starting with, ethnic funerals. Funerals in different cultures are very, very different from ours. At the present moment, we've got a small cartoon beardy man on television telling everybody they don't need to be buried in the ground. They can just get cremated because it's cheap. But you still got plenty of time, Grandad. Oh, but nobody lives forever. Right, we understand this. And that's basically the 2 choices you've got. You can either be buried or you can be burned. Burning obviously turns you back into ash, you go back into the ground, and there we have what James Earl Jones described as the circle of life. You get stuck in a box, you're there, and the chances are nowadays that some oik will dig down and use your thigh bone as a club to hurt somebody. So, I mean, you've got your choices. A lot of people feel that they've kind of got to do the in a coffin thing. Oh, well, the family would expect it. The family don't care. They're just wondering how much money you've got left and whether or not your house has been sold yet. So, bottom line, ethnic funerals, how different could they possibly be to a British one? I've always said that, when the solicitor gathers the family around a table to read the will, my will is going to read, "This is the will of Alan William Robson." Yes, I've got a Willie in the middle. And being of sound mind, he spent it all. And that is absolutely still the plan. Now, ethnic funerals, let's have a dive in. Now, funeral goers in America, they seem to be a hell of a lot more squeamish than we are, because they try to avoid anything that is unnecessarily distressing about death. It's been taken to its logical conclusion in California, where it is common for the body itself not to be at the funeral. You know, in Britain, there's always like a coffin at the top of the room, or you see it slide behind the curtain, usually to Monty Python's song from The Life of Brian, Always Look on the Bright Side of Life. However, in America, they don't put the coffin there because it upsets people. How about that? Now, the Miami headhunters of New Guinea, and they still exist, they never bury their dead. The dead bodies are left to rot on platforms out in the open. Female mourners smear themselves with poo from the dead bodies as a sign of respect to the deceased. Because the one thing that not anybody will tell you is that when you're dead, you relax all of your muscles, including your bum muscle. So usually it's diarrhea or not very nice. You know, when they draw those pictures on the ground of dead bodies, they never put a puddle around the poo. Now, Maasai tribesmen, we often look at the Maasai, usually bouncing up and down for no apparent reason, but we always rate them and we think they're fantastic farmers and all the rest of it. However, the Maasai tribesmen, they leave their dead relatives out in the middle of the countryside for the hyenas to eat. Nature, they go back to nature. Now, some of the Australian Aborigines, they used to lacerate themselves. They'd get a knife and they'd cut their own flesh when one of their friends was being buried as a mark of respect. Widows would burn their breasts, burn their arms and burn their legs with fiery brands. And now and then things got out of hand, and during the morning people would burn themselves to death or slash a vein or an artery and bleed out. Let's keep going. In Fiji, it was once traditional for any of the wives of the dead to be strangled or buried alive with their deceased husbands. They had another custom like that in New Guinea. The widow would actually request to be strangled so that she could accompany her husband on his trip into the next world. Yeah, probably just what he needs. He was hoping for a bit of peace, and oh, here she comes. In Irian Jaya, you might not have heard of that place, because I must admit I hadn't had to look it up. It's in Indonesia. Dead leaders of the country and people of great power were slowly smoked over a fire for several months when they die. Then the smoked bodies, looking a bit like a Crasta kipper on a good day, would be hung from the eaves of their own houses. People could come in and see their smoked and desiccated remains. And apparently, while they were hanging from the eaves of their house, they could keep a permanent eye on the family home. Although if a burglar did get in, wouldn't really be able to do very much about it. Let's stay in Indonesia, I think, because there's other tribesmen there called the Mambai. Now, whenever a tribesman from the Mambai tribe died, it was customary for the dead body to be seated in his or her chair in the family house. And then relatives would sit around and watch it rot for as long as they could tolerate, especially the stench that it would have. In some parts of Indonesia, the widow of the dead was obliged to rub fluids from his decomposing corpse onto her own body. That would stink. Now, the Javaro people of South America, they bury their women and children under the floorboards of their house. The men are placed in a sitting position in the hut, and then the hut and the body set on fire. So, it is kind of like cremation, but they take the fancy route. There's so many fascinating stories like this. In some cultures, funerals, and this is something that I actually believe, the pagan way, the old-fashioned way, it was not a thing where you mourn somebody and say, oh, poor old Alfie, wasn't he a nice bloke? No, you would celebrate the life of them. So it would be a celebration of the person who's passed over, rather than mourn death, because death comes to everybody. And the most weird and extreme example of this celebration thing is practiced by the Nyack Yusa people of Africa, where younger tribesmen and younger tribeswomen have sex around the grave. Yeah, all at the same time. Bit of an orgy. Any excuse, I suppose. But my final one, also downright peculiar, because I wouldn't be telling you it otherwise, would I? The Berawan tribe, and they're based in Borneo, they pot their dead relatives in large earthenware jars, and then, as the corpse rots, they drain off all of the bodily fluids that have oozed out of them through a hole in the bottom of the jar and down a long bamboo tube. Later on, the dried remains are removed and put into a much smaller receptacle, because by then all the skin's off your bones. The big jars are considered far too valuable to waste a dead body on, because they can be used in the kitchen to make and store rice wine. So get the dead relative out, get rid of his oozings down a tube, then put your bait on. That's my little piece on ethnic and weird and bizarre funerals. But we're not stopping there, of course, because it's the Grisly Tales podcast. So therefore, I thought we would take a look at something downright peculiar. Now, I thought I would take a look at some of the most horrific ways to torture people. Yeah? Now, starting off with something that many of you will have heard of, basically because of Bonfire Night. It's called the wheel, or the Catherine wheel. Now, obviously the little Catherine wheel, you nail it onto a door, usually somebody else's because you don't want a hole in yours, and you light it, and it spins round and round and round and round and round and burns the paint off that other person's door. Now, where does it get its name? Well, it's a medieval device what they used to do, they would put a large wagon wheel on a wall. They wouldn't leave it attached to a cart or anything. They would put it on a wall, and then they would tie your victim to this large wheel. Now remember, the wheel can still spin. They've put it onto an axle on the wall so it can spin. And the executioner would then take a swing at the spinning victim with a gigantic iron hammer. This was a display not just to kill them, because they always killed them eventually, but sometimes they'd do it day by day by day by day, which just makes it excruciating. Because if you can imagine, there are you, arms and legs spread out, usually naked, and anybody can do anything to you all day. And then at a predetermined time, usually midday, out comes the torturer with a gigantic iron hammer. You swing it, you swing the wheel like Wheel of Fortune, round and round and round it goes. Where it stops, no one will know. And while it's still spinning fast, you take a hook at it with this hammer. Now you might miss altogether, stopping the wheel, or you might break an arm or a leg, or shatter a rib, or hit the stomach and squish all of your internal organs. You don't want to kill them. You want to come back tomorrow and have another go, and then another, and then another, and spread it out for a week. This display was considered entertainment for the townspeople, and they all gathered and they all watched. And some of them bought little tiny Catherine wheels, not the firework, just little wheels, to remember the day that such and such was placed onto the wheel. It's a nasty, nasty way to die. And die they always did. Now, a lot of people have heard of the Chinese water torture, but how many of you actually know what it is? It's not waterboarding, which apparently seems to be one of the things that the Americans do to try and get somebody usually not of their culture to give up the goods. The Chinese water torture is even more extreme to a degree, because the victim is put underneath a very slow but continuous stream of water droplets, like drop. Now, at first, not a big deal, but eventually, the slow and repetitive tapping of water, if done over days, not hours, on the victim's forehead, is enough to drive them completely insane. And once they get to that place where the brain can't cope with it anymore, they would put their hand under a drop, and their head's waiting for the drop, no drop. And it completely screws with your mind. You would think, blame me, if you're going to be tortured at all, get the Chinese water torture. Blame me, you get more drops than that in your standard shower, which is true. However, it drives you completely mad. Another one that I suppose you would know, possibly even seen in torture chambers around the country. There's still a particularly good one at Chillingham Castle. The rack. It's one of the easiest torture methods to recognize. It came originally from medieval Europe. The victim gets their ankles and wrists tied to this device. And at the bottom end, two executioners got hold of the handles and started turning the rack's gears. Slowly but surely, the machine would pull on the victim's limbs in opposite direction until, first of all, they dislocated their wrists, then they would dislocate their elbows, then they would dislocate their shoulders, then they would dislocate their feet, then they would dislocate their knees, and then they'd dislocate their top of their thigh, and then, as if that wasn't hurting enough. Now, you remember, they didn't just do this it's over. They would crank him a little bit every day. Dying could take up to 5 months. And by the time that your first limb dismembers itself, breaks free of the body, you have been in horrific pain for the longest time, and eventually your arms and your legs would be pulled off. Now, strangely enough, if one was torn off, and they were, then normally what the executioner or one of the prison guards would do is get a red-hot shovel and then put the red-hot shovel onto the open wound to seal it, and then wait until the other limbs come off, then they'd seal that the same way. Now, because of this, they weren't allowed to bleed to death. Because they didn't bleed to death, they stayed alive, and they just had a head and a torso. And on some occasions, they would be decapitated. On other cases, they'd be smashed. The head would be smashed flat with a hammer. And on 1 or 2 occasions, they then set the man free, put him outside the city gates, where he starved to death and animals fed off them. Now, that isn't a pleasant way to go. Now, also looking at a thing that you may also have seen. It's called the Chinese torture chair. Now, they used to interrogate an awful lot of people in 19th century China during the 1800s. They had a chair covered with thin, almost razor blade thin blades all over the chair. And this would provide a slow and painful death to anybody that they strapped into it. Imagine sitting on a chair that had 500 razor blades all pointing up, and you got diced. Now, this chair, some people believe, was rarely used. They thought it was just a symbol of power, and nobody wanted to upset the leaders, so that they had to face such a chair. But face the chair they did, and thousands died sitting in it, and then their arms forced down onto the arms of the chair that also had 200 razor blades or razor blade-esque blades attached to it. Again, an ugly and downright nasty way to go. Now, anybody that is married will know that occasionally, just occasionally, once in a blue moon, your lady love may well let her mouth go, and you think, for heaven's sake, shut your mouth. Well, you shouldn't do that. You should have more respect for your partner. However, back in the day, it seems that British men didn't, and they created a thing called the scold's bridle. Now, this was actually as much a form of public humiliation rather than torture. And if there was a wife who was accused of putting it about with somebody else, or selling their body, becoming prostitute for money, or witchcraft even, this iron mask would be locked onto the woman's head. It had a spiked mouthpiece that would prevent the wearer from speaking at all, because if she tried to open her mouth, it would cut into her upper and lower lip. Sharp nails and spikes. So the scold's bridle was worn, and the worst you could do is probably told her this: "Get this bloody thing off me now! I'll chin you, you bastard!" Right, so that's the scold's bridle. I'm sure she was probably even angrier than that. Also, let's talk about something that you probably own. How can it be a torture? Well, it's a slightly different thing. Have you got a pair of boots in the house? Yeah. Some of you might have football boots, climbing boots, cowboy boots. Blimey, we got all kinds of boots, haven't we? Uggs, I suppose, classed as a comfy boot. Well, the boot was quite usually described as the most severe and cruel punishment in the world. Now you see, these boots were iron, or in some cases wooden, and they'd be placed on the victim's legs, and a solid wedge would be inserted between the leg and the walls of the boots. So once you put the wedge inside, a blow from the sledgehammer would drive the wedge deeper into the boot, creating excruciating pain to the victim because your bones are being crushed. Your ankle bone flattened, all your toes broken, and your leg shattered, the bones into tiny little pieces. And when the boot was removed, you couldn't stand on it. It needed cutting off. But they weren't going to do that either. They were then going to start hammering your other leg. See how you felt about that? So what else? Could there possibly be worse tortures? Yeah, we're just getting really into the top 10 now. Have you heard of something called Ling Chi? Now, you possibly haven't, but in numerous films, especially even films in the 30s and 40s, they described a thing that happened in China as death by 1,000 cuts, and that's what Ling Chi is. It was popular in the 1300s during the Ming Dynasty, and it was reserved for the most severe crimes. Now, this was what it says, death by 1,000 cuts. The slow and methodical slicing of the body over a long period of time. They might cut the top of your toe off, then cut a little bit more, then a little bit more, and then cut the top of your toe down to the bone, and then a little bit higher up, and then take some of that thin skin off the top of your foot. By the time you'd had 1,000 cuts, your face was unrecognizable, your body was in pieces, and you were bleeding out in all directions, and you would die. Then there's a gadget called the breast ripper. Now, I've seen a few of these on my journeys across Germany, and it was an awful and ugly looking instrument used in medieval Germany. It looks a little like a gadget that you can buy at garden centres with 3 prongs. It's a little hand tool that can break up heavier clay soil. And yet, in medieval Germany, they had a really sharpened one to literally rip the breasts off women. At first, it would be heated, in some cases frozen. Then it was clamped onto a woman's breast and then yanked away. When they wanted to put on a show, they would attach it to a woman's breast, tie it to a tree, tie the other end to a horse, and then the horse would run off, ripping off one breast. Then there'd be a second horse latched onto her other breast, and then that horse would go too. In some cases, it tore off half the woman's flesh, right the way up to her neck. The Iron Maiden, oh blimey, Bruce Dickinson and Nico McBrain and the rest of the guys from the band named themselves after a horrific thing. This tends to get associated predominantly with the Spanish Inquisition, yet they had these things all over the world. It's a coffin-like device shaped like a person, and inside a series of spikes. The victim would be put inside the chamber, then the executioner would close the door behind them. A lot of people, again, have said, oh, well, surely that was never used. That kind of device, just being there, probably made an awful lot of prisoners tell everything they had. And when you look inside, if ever you have the occasion, and once again, Chillingham has a fine example of a one that looks to be based on Queen Elizabeth I. It has nails and spikes at chest level. It has nails and spikes to take out your innards at stomach level. And it has a whole pile of spikes that would rip into your genitalia. You got to remember, every time you go in there, the spikes are in a slightly different place. And some people were placed in it until they died. Others were placed in it time after time after time. Now, another thing that you probably heard of and probably know all about, fleeing. Now, some people like a bit of a whipping when they're having sex and fooling around with a member of the opposite, or the same nowadays, because we're a mixed world. And yet, the fleeing thing, it used to be called being skinned alive, because it is and always was, an active corporal punishment. Now, there's even some evidence that the Assyrians would hang the skin of their defeated enemies on their city walls as a warning to others. And right the way across the wall, thousands of skins of skinned enemies waiting there to deter anybody else from trying to get into that castle. The flaying, quite often done with wood like birch, and others used leather, but they would keep belting, they would keep flaying until they were literally down to the bone. Then pirate ships, not just pirate ships, but also Royal Navy ships. They all had a punishment called keel hauling. This was particularly popular during the 1700s. Pirates and the Royal Navy, the pirates actually took it from the Royal Navy because it was a Royal Navy punishment first. Victims would be tied to the ship and thrown overboard to be dragged behind it, and in most cases dragged under the ship and up the other side, and all of the barnacles, which were really super sharp on the bottom of the boat, would tear the skin from the victims, usually bringing any hungry sharks or any other fish that fancied a bit of human flesh to come out of the water and have a go at the man drowning literally underneath the ship. Now, in some cases, men managed to get across to the other side alive, bleeding usually, but alive, and they were dragged back on the ship, only to be carried back to the other side and thrown back over again until they were dead. In many occasions, depending in which seas he happened to be operating, as soon as they went in the water, a shark would have them, and then the rest of the crew on board merely just kept a hold of the rope until there was nothing left on the other end. Okay, let's have a look at the top 4. Now, this is particularly nasty. It's called the brazen bull. Now, it's not one of those machines you sometimes see in pubs where usually a woman who's usually just an ounce too large to sit on the back of a bull gets thrown about and eventually goes back down on the ground, legs akimbo. Well, in the 6th century BC, there was a worker of brass whose name was Perillus of Athens, and he came up with what at the time was the most sadistic torture ever: the brazen bull. In this device, the victim would be put inside a hollow brass bull. You got to remember, he's in the belly bit of a huge brass bull, life-size. Then they would light a fire underneath the bull, and a system of tubes inside the statue would amplify the victim's screams, and it sounded like a raging bull. The story says that the ruler, Phalaris, was so appalled by the device, he tricked Perillus, the man who invented it, to get into the bull, and Perillus was the first ever victim. Well, how about that? Absolutely horrific. The brazen bull. Nobody knows to this day how used it was, but if it was used at all, it was a hell of a way to go. Now, a torture that came from Germany, and they say that they got it from ancient China, and I probably believe it, but it was used commonly in British prisons throughout the 17, 18, and early 1900s. It's featured also, if you watch the Game of Thrones, you'll know about this torture. It's called the rat. Now, what you would do, you would get the man and you would stretch him out and you would hang him over a space usually. So his shoulders are on a bench and his bum's on a bench, and the bit in between would be stripped, his stomach and chest, and you would get a basket full of starving rats, and you would put this basket onto the belly of the victim. Then you would remove the bottom of the container, take that out. So the only thing stopping the rats from escaping is the flesh of the man that they would start to eat. They would also, on some occasions, heat the pot that the rats were in to distress the rats and make them start chewing and gnawing through anything in their way. You can't blame the rats for trying to escape by eating their way through the belly of a human being. So we're heading towards the top 2 tortures of all time. I mean, there's many more I could share with you, but the one that we've put in second place is a thing called the heretic's fork. Now, you got to remember, when the Catholic Church was killing and murdering anybody who chose not to believe in the Catholic Church, they came up with this special torture device. This was for anybody who spoke out against Catholicism during the Middle Ages. It had 2 spiky ends, and the device was attached to a victim's neck, and it was only removed after the wearer had spoken the words, "I recant." Now, it was attached to their neck, and yet if they tried to sleep, it would puncture their throat and they would die. If they bumped into anybody, it would puncture their throat and they would die. And on numerous occasions, because you got to remember, not too many people survived the heretic's fork. On many, many occasions, one of the priests would come and force the fork into the neck, so that heretic was saved from being a heretic by dying. But the one that I've picked to be the number 1, which is just downright awful, is a thing called the Judas cradle. Now, this is a nasty thing. Imagine a pyramid, but a one that's not quite pyramid shaped, but slightly sharper at the, well, in fact, a lot sharper at the top. Because once again, in medieval times, the Judas cradle became one of the most disturbing and intimidating torture methods. The victims would be hoisted up on a rope, their hands, knees, and ankles broken, and then they would be lowered with the tip of the Judas cradle on their anus, and the sharp point and gravity doing its thing would force itself into the body, sending it going down and bursting out over 4 sides. So the front would burst, the 2 sides would burst, and the back would burst, all through the sharpness of this pyramid going right up your fundament. And that is as grisly as it comes, certainly for this week. However, we've got grisly tales more to come, but now you know a little bit more about man's inhumanity to man. Let's get some more tales told, shall we? And don't forget, if you would like to help us out, we have a donations button. If you go to robsonsworld.com, and there, a whole pile of photographs, a whole pile of all kinds of things for you to maybe download and enjoy. We would love you to help us out if you can. But let's go across to Barbados. Blimey, if only we could, if only travel was as easy these days. I want to tell you about the British ethnic minority, because we always think of other races as ethnic minorities, and yet in numerous countries around the world, we are that minority. Now, most people are not even aware that the majority of slaves in the late 1500s and early 1600s were actually British. At that time, only 3% were from Africa, and only 7% of slaves had dark skins. Along with Australia, the Caribbean seemed to be the perfect dumping place for anybody that Britain wanted to get rid of. Rapists, thieves, cattle rustlers, anarchists, rebels, all the way down to unwanted children. Barbados was the very first stop where those that survived the horrendous sea crossing would be dragged off the ship. They were paraded along the dockside for potential buyers to take a close look at them. Irish, Scottish, Northerners, Welsh, and English by the hundred. A document from 1598 wrote, "Even in slavery, the Irish always appeared intoxicated, unable to speak a hint of the King's English." History was later changed to show that this never happened, but it did. And 100 years later, in an attempt to prove the superiority of the white race, they decided to rewrite the history of slavery, writing out that any British had ever been slaves. Yet 12 months earlier, 97% of most plantations were from Great Britain. Paintings of kings of England were whitened if they had Italian, German or Southern French blood in their veins, when in fact they were quite dark. Charles I, the king, was one of many that they whitened in their pictures just for show. In 1655, thousands of British had died or were killed or executed, yet others served what they called their indentures, with the court sentencing them to 10 years on the plantation. Now, once they had served that, they were actually given their freedom, and many became planters themselves. Knowing how awful slaves were treated, you would think these new planters would be kinder to their slaves. Yet the reverse was true. Thomas Craig was an ex-slave, having been sent to the colonies for not supporting the king. He was a well-to-do ship's merchant, most unhappy that almost 60% of what he made was going to the king's navy at a third of its value. His crews were gathering weapons, gunpowder, equipment and food for ships, forced to sell to the navy for next to nothing. He made the mistake of saying it out loud in front of a colonel, and within days he was in chains as an anarchist. Having served his 10 years on Barbados, he bought some land, planted it, sold his crop, bought more land, planted it, and so on. And within 9 years he had the 5th biggest plantation on the island. His nickname was Sugar Craig, providing the world with the sugar that it sought. Although most of his slaves were white, he treated them appallingly. He was cruel for the sake of it, and actively enjoyed meting out punishments, especially with the whip and the hose, lashing men, women and children until you could see their bones. Yet for women, if they tried to escape or abort their children, it was a common practice when they'd been raped by slave owners, Craig had a unique punishment that would later be used by the Nazis in World War II. They wanted to know who was aborting children, for more children equaled more workers to use or to sell. They wanted to know who were trying to escape. That information they would get from the women. A super powerful hose was placed between their legs and turned on gently at first. If they confessed, those they had named would be executed. Often they would name anybody, so heinous was the torture. On several occasions, women were filled with water so powerful that they actually exploded into pieces. Other women seeing this would confess at the very mention of it. Now remember, Craig was doing this to his own people, and yet those with darker skins were treated even worse. Given the most horrific and dangerous jobs, if they were injured, losing fingers, a hand or a leg, they would be hanged for dereliction of duty. All the slaves hated him, as did his own men, and yet the legend tells of him dying at the hands of a most unlikely enemy. His wife was called Eileen, a sweet and gentle Scottish woman from Pitlochry that Craig had met in Jamaica while selling his sugar. She had borne him 3 sons, Thomas Jr., Matthew, and James, and a daughter, Madeline, and they all readied to take over from him. The sons just enjoyed raping the slaves and getting drunk, but then again, so did their father. So he believed they were learning the craft from him. Madeline was only 16, but far more worldly wise. She could see far better ways to run this massive plantation and also make more money. Her father wouldn't listen, not to a slip of a girl. He was usually drunk or horny, either way unwilling to allow any woman lecture him. He would beat her with a wooden stave, and he warned her he would make her a slave if she kept on at him. But over the forthcoming weeks, she studied his cruelty, watching him emasculate men with his knife, slice off the breasts of troublesome women. He would rape children, male or female, from the age 4 upwards. And Madeline once asked, "Why do you hurt these people? They work so hard for you." His reply, "To make them work even harder. As long as I can see how they look at me, I will revenge myself on them. I keep them alive, yet they loathe and despise me. I see it in their rebellious eyes." His words were of steel. Then Sugar Craig took Madeline's house servant Maggie, the woman who had wet nursed her and raised her, and Madeline protested. This northern woman had loved her like a mother, yet for drinking the remnants of a milk jug, she was about to be executed at Craig's own hand. Madeline shouted, "Father, there's something you should know. The boys are ill, maybe dead." Well, Craig stopped worrying about the woman and raced towards where Madeline was, demanding to know where the kids were. He discovered their 3 twisted corpses in the warm and cosy blacksmith's shed, where they'd been drinking as usual. Yet the bottle smelled strange. Was it poison? Craig turned to question Madeline, but before he could say a word, she pushed a red-hot poker from the blacksmith's fire into his eye. He fell to the ground screaming as she jabbed it again into his other eye. Blinded, he pulled out his saber and began swishing it in all directions. And Madeline picked up a shovel, and as Craig neared the fire, she hit him squarely on the back of his head, and his face fell into the flames, and being unconscious, stayed there, and he burned himself alive. Madeline took 2 horses from the building as the blacksmith's shop began to burn. She told the slaves, "Let it burn. There is nothing of value inside," remembering it had her 3 brothers and her father. And the following day, with her mother's permission, she took over the plantation. She became Madeleine Sugar Craig, and the 2 women enjoyed the rest of their lives, arranging parties, travelling to Europe, all without the hindrance of brutal, drunken men. Madeline lived to the age of 88, and over that time she gave hundreds of slaves their freedom. And on to our final tale for this Grisly Tales podcast. Please spread the word and get as many people joining the throng as possible. It is a world of fascination that you will not get anywhere else. Daniel Boone, old-fashioned black and white TV show from the 60s, starring Fess Parker. Daniel Boone was a man, a great man, one of America's great pioneers, and yet he was of Welsh ancestry, and he loved hearing about the ancient stories of Wales that told of bravery and summoning up the courage of the dragon. He used to tell his parents that he didn't know whether he was brave enough, and his dad, Squire Boone, used to say, "You'll never know if you have the courage unless you test yourself." And from the youngest age, young Daniel was desperate to do just that. His mother Sarah had been chased out of Wales because she was a Quaker, and they found themselves getting a ship from Exeter to Pennsylvania in 1711. And here, they joined their fellow Quaker dissenters led by William Penn, who would end up naming the state Pennsylvania. It was a difficult time to be a pacifist, because all Quakers are pacifists, because they lived near a number of American tribes, and by the age of 12, young Daniel Boone was a marksman with a rifle and a consummate hunter, shooting bears and panthers before reaching 15. And on one occasion, whilst out with a couple of families, a panther appeared and raced towards them, wanting to snatch one of the children, scattering the crowd. And yet the only one not to move was a 13-year-old Daniel Boone. Instead, he merely aimed his rifle at the panther as it leapt at him, and with a single shot, killed it with a bullet through its head. Then, some of the Boone family married worldlings. These are people who weren't Quakers, and they were promptly expelled from the Quaker faith. The family upped sticks and travelled further into the wild country of North Carolina, where they became Christians, and Squire Boone then had all of his family baptized. Now, a lot of people say that Daniel Boone was illiterate, but that's not true. He did spend more time in the woods than the classroom, but he could read and write, and he had a knowledge of a number of Native American dialects. During the French and Indian War, where Britain and its native tribes took on the French with their indigenous allies, Boone became a wagoner, leading wagon trains towards the front to stock forts and encampments. And he was lucky to survive it, as over 1,000 French supporting Indians attacked their wagon trains, stealing all of their goods. Boone was one of only 4 men to survive. And he only managed to survive because he hid in the stomach of a dead horse on the battlefield. Once the war was over, Boone returned to hunting and beating all comers at the amount of success he had. He came home to marry Rebecca Bryan, and he would go on to have 10 children. Yet they would see very little of him, because he would go on what he described as medicine trails, long journeys collecting a year's worth of profit, returning 7 or 8 months later with carts filled with pelts of all kind, but mostly the valuable bison. On one occasion, Daniel Boone was gone for over 2 years, 3 months. In fact, his wife thought he was dead, so she'd had a fling with his brother Ned, which led to a daughter that Boone accepted as his own, but took his wife back too. In 1762, the Cherokee War began, and after a few attacks, the entire family would seek refuge in Virginia, where he formed a militia that he led and went back into Cherokee territory, rescuing any women and children stolen by them. Eventually, he said, "We have no choice but to hunt them down and kill them like dogs." And this the militia did, and very well. And once again, he was away from his wife for another 2 years. And yet around this time, the flood of immigrants pouring into the area, starving the land of game. So Boone had to go even further. He even bought some land in Pensacola, Florida, but his wife refused to travel so far away from her friends. So they agreed to gather a group of friends who would all travel off to Kentucky. He became friends with the indigenous tribe, the Iroquois, and traded goods with them. The tribes told Boone of incredible lands far to the west and south, and he was determined to see them. Whilst exploring, he was captured by the Shawnee, who believed all of Kentucky was theirs. All 2 years' worth of his pelts were confiscated, but they let him live, provided he vowed never to return, and this he promptly ignored and began stocking up a supply to be sold for his family's benefit. In fact, Boone was now living in a new settlement with 53 other immigrants. They were warned off by the Delaware tribe, telling them that the entire country was home of the red man and there was no place for the whites. Once they were ignored, Boone's son James and Henry Russell were captured and gruesomely tortured to death, their eyes gouged out, and they were found tied to wagon wheels with a fire lit between their legs. Boone stopped any of his family venturing out, for this was the beginning of a number of massacres of white settlements. In fact, Boone was soon off again, warning all white families to escape to Virginia, and many did. Those that did not were raped and murdered, their children taken to be raised as Native Americans. During this time, Daniel established a town called Boonesboro and brought his family and friends into Kentucky to live there, still fighting the various tribes, but this time with enough men to see them off. Then, the American Revolutionary War began, with many wondering why they paid taxes to Britain when they got nothing in return, certainly no security of any kind. And during this time, Boone's daughter Jemima and two other teenage girls were taken by a Shawnee war party heading to the safety of their land in Ohio. Boone gathered a militia again, and off he went, tracking them. And within 2 days, they surrounded their camp whilst they were eating a meal. And they rode down on them, Boone in particular, standing in front of the captured girls, fighting off any Indians seeking to kill them. Using the butt of his pistol and a hatchet, he took out around a dozen Indians, ending up completely covered in blood, roaring out in anger. He told Jemima, "Finally, I unleashed that Welsh dragon that my gramps told me about." Eventually, the Native Americans began to run off as the musket balls whistled past them, and Daniel Boone became a Western legend overnight. Everyone knew who he was. The British in particular wanted him dead, because he was firmly on the American side. And once outside the fort, a number of British sharpshooters saw him and decided to fire at him. One of their bullets hit Daniel in the ankle, yet whilst he was lying on the ground, he held them off until his men from the fort could drag him in. Whilst he was in charge of 30 men, Daniel Boone was captured by Chief Blackfish, who was in charge of 300 Shawnee fighters fighting for the British. Boone convinced him not to attack Boonesboro, saying that they couldn't last 3 weeks more, so it would be easier to starve them out. Daniel appeared to have changed loyalties. Even his own men began calling him names and insulting him. And this worked in his favour. The Chief Blackfish took his prisoners to Chillicothe and made them run the gauntlet to prove their courage. If they survived this gauntlet, they could join their tribe, replacing falling warriors. And it was then that Boone heard Blackfish was about to take a bigger force against his settlement. Boone and 8 of his surviving men escaped the camp, riding 300 miles to warn the people of Boonesboro. Daniel had no idea that his wife and 4 children had thought he was dead, again, and travelled back to Virginia. Boone had lived with the Shawnee, and for those who doubted him, he led an attack on their villages, and then took back as many men as he could to gather to defend Boonesboro. He held out after a 10-day siege against Blackfish and the British cannon. One of Boone's men still charged him with fighting for the Shawnee, and a court-martial found him not guilty, and to incense the people who hated him, the court actually thanked Daniel Boone for all he had done and ended up promoting him. Now, the following years, Daniel Boone, an action man, was a bit unsettled. He was robbed of most of his money by a financial scam, and he had to work hard to get it back to pay off his investors. All the while, the Shawnees, any chance they got, wanted to kill their greatest enemy, Daniel Boone. Daniel took part in the Battle of Piqua in 1780 as the Revolutionary War rolled on. This included an invasion of Ohio, and he came close to death 1,000 times, including one day when a cannonball took off his horse's head while he was riding it. In between military campaigns, Boone would be off hunting, always his greatest of passions. He was there with his brother Ned when a Shawnee war party attacked him. Ned was shot and killed, and the Shawnee decapitated him, telling everyone that they had finally got their most deadly enemy. Yet, Daniel Boone had actually escaped, but he was captured by British dragoons. But he was released 3 days later when Cornwallis surrendered in Yorktown, and the Americans had won the day. After the war, Boone was off again. He found himself voted into Virginia's General Assembly. But he was no politician, and as soon as another Indian war began, off he went again. He fed captured Shawnee and negotiated peace with them. However, others fought on until their final destruction at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. By this time, Daniel Boone was running a trading post, and he was bored stiff by it. So he ended up getting himself elected to the Virginia House of Delegates, but missed far too many meetings by going out hunting and fishing. Because Daniel Boone always had itchy feet. He took his family to Missouri, where the Spanish then ruled. The Spanish governor named Boone as a military commandant of the area. And for the rest of his life, there were dozens of hunting-related stories about Daniel Boone. He was also in sufficient power to decide if murderers and rapists lived or died, as a Spanish commandant had the same powers of a judge and jury back then, and on a few occasions he had vicious men hanged. Ironically, Daniel Boone feasted on a wild pig that he'd shot, and he suffered extreme indigestion, and he died the self-same night. He was 85, which was very, very old for those violent times, and he was buried next to his beloved Rebecca in Took Creek. Yet the bones were disinterred and reburied at the old Bryan farm in Missouri, although it is claimed that Frankfort Cemetery in Kentucky also claim it. His spirit is said to walk at Took Creek, maybe not realizing that his body is now no longer there. All grisly tales on the Grisly Tales podcast. Thank you for being with us. Any help you can give us, please go to robsonsworld.com. Makes a tremendous difference, and I'm so grateful to you. Come back and bring friends for the next Grisly Tale. From me, Alan Robson, thanks for your company. God bless you, and I wish you well.